Once we start to disagree, then we have a tendency that we're going to disengage because you're talking about someone's core values, and as soon as you start to challenge someone's core values, they will argue back, and if they cannot convince you that theirs is the more right data, they will disengage in the dialogue.
You can tell me all the facts in the world, this is 76% of why you should believe this, but if it doesn't fit in my frame, then I totally disregard it as perhaps even real or relevant information, and that's how I disengage, by totally distancing myself from everything you have to say. We have this big sort of cultural umbrella value about competitive listening, and we're not actually listening with our hearts. We're constantly thinking about the next thing that we're going to say because we've already engaged in that debate.
It is interesting because when we think about how trauma impacts us and how having our core values or our mental models and worldviews challenged, the research tells us that it is the same response that we get as if a toxic event happens. It, in fact, will hijack the amygdala in the same way, send us to that place of fight, flight, freeze. And literally, we're struggling to figure out how we're going to deal with this.
You go into defense mode. You try to protect everything that you've known and how you've protected yourself this far, and how can that possibly change, because then my whole life will radically change.
And once the amygdala kicks in, the rest of your brain is kicked out.
Yeah.
To hear and to be in the dialogues that we're talking about in a way that will actually change things, we have to be in this space. And it is a heart space.
It is.
It's not a head space, it's a heart space. Rather than going in and tackling a problem, I have to create space and place where people feel safe enough that they can have the dialogue without having the amygdala take over. So the implications for me is that, and for the dialogue, is that it's the time before the dialogue that everyone would say is the meaningful dialogue takes place. But this is the space, the pre-work that has to be done to build the relationships that will facilitate all of the conflict and the challenges that will come. But it means that I've got to do this pre-work with people, which is what in most cases people don't want to do. They want you to go in, do the work, do, and they don't realize that the dialogue in itself is the do. That's where the big piece happens.
So to be able to handle that if disagreement or conflict comes up, which it always does, how do we handle this? How can we come back? How can we give people an onboarding ramp off of that disengagement, even if it's the next time we meet? Like, how can we revisit these things and re-engage with each other and the topic?
That's the piece that will hold everything together later on, and not just in that session, but in sessions to come. And if they can actually stay in that space long enough, what they'll create is a community of practice. And within that community of practice, people will forget about who brought the work to the table. They'll just start to do the work, and they'll let go of all of the preconceived ideas, and new things will start to come. That's the space of innovation, and that's what we keep saying we want, but we're not brave enough to stay in the space where the chaos happens.
I think for me as a person, as an individual, it starts with recognizing, like even naming this mental model gave me something to attach to so that I can more easily recognize when it shows up in my life. To not only then step into the discomfort and step into the disagreement, but like, what is my role in that? Because where I stand as also a woman too, stepping into this conflict is, confrontational, and that's absurd, and that's outside of my role or whatever. And so thinking about, okay, so when I step into this disagreement, because now I've noticed it, how can I step into this dialogue? And then like observing my behavior in it. Just on a basic level, at least for me, it takes noticing and leaning into it in a conscious way. And that's also shaped by understanding the ramifications of what happens when I disengage. And
I'm interested in figuring out, how do we tackle this dialogue around racism with everybody in the room? So what is the way that we create the space that's safe enough for everyone to be there? Because if all we do is we begin to reach that space where we're engaging, then there's the conflict and the tension, and we disengage and run away, we never solve this problem. In fact, in my mind, what it says is that folks want this to continue this way so that the status quo remains. I'm not interested in it staying the same. I'm interested in us changing a discourse. I'm interested in us changing the language so that everybody can feel safe enough to be in the dialogue. How do we go away from the disagreement disengagement piece to more of an understanding that we're going to have disagreements, and that's okay. The very term diversity in and of itself means inviting in things that are different. That means conflict. And yet we seem to be conflict averse when it comes to this. We have to figure out how to be comfortable with the conflict and be able to stay in the space and have the dialogues that we really need to have so that we can move beyond this.